In 1916, a line was quietly and secretly drawn on a map. A year later, just 67 words were written in a letter. Two events, born not in the lands they would reshape, but in the shadowed corridors of European diplomacy. They weren't just ink on paper. They were seeds. Seeds from which the modern Middle East would grow. A region tangled in its branches and often bearing bitter fruit. This was no mere drawing of borders. It was a geopolitical experiment, a social re-engineering imposed upon a land of ancient civilizations and cultures too deep to be measured by colonial compasses. Beat pause. Have you ever wondered, why are so many of today's conflicts intractable? Why do identities, both national and regional, feel fragile yet fiercely defended? The present we live in was not born of the moment. It is the result of decisions made a century ago, of wars, revolutions, and ambitions layered like sediment across time. To understand this history is not an intellectual indulgence. It is a necessity if we are to grasp our present and shape a different future.
In this series, we will examine pivotal transformations. These were not fleeting events, but dominoes, each one toppling the next, creating the complex geopolitical and social landscape we see before us today. Our goal is not merely to narrate history, but to delve deeper, to analyze how each event impacted the lives of the region's peoples, how the threads of the past remain tightly woven into the fabric of our present, and how they shape our perceptions and our conflicts. We will ask, what were the true motives behind these decisions? What were the unintended consequences that later emerged? And how did the peoples of the region receive these transformations? And what were their reactions? Today, in our first episode, we return to the starting point, to the moment the first lines of the modern map were drawn, Sykes-Picot. In the midst of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled the region for centuries, was in its death throes. Britain and France saw this as a golden strategic opportunity to expand their imperial influence and secure their growing interests in a vital region that connects 3 continents and holds increasing geopolitical and economic importance, especially with the prospect of vast oil discoveries. It was not just about controlling territory, but about securing trade routes to eastern colonies and controlling vital strategic corridors. This secret agreement between the 2 great colonial powers, Britain and France, with the tacit consent of Tsarist Russia, aimed to divide the inheritance of the sick man of Europe, partitioning the Ottoman lands in the Fertile Crescent into spheres of influence that would define the region's future for decades to come. Its drawn borders were not final or precise, but rather a general framework for future understandings. Under its terms, France was to receive direct influence in Syria and Lebanon, while Britain would gain influence in Iraq and Jordan. As for Palestine, it was designated for international administration, a provision that would later spark immense complications. The true significance of the Sykes-Picot Agreement lies not only in its secret clauses and temporary administrative divisions, but in the stark way it embodied the logic of colonial partition. It deliberately ignored the social, cultural, historical, and economic bonds that had united the peoples of the region for centuries. This agreement entrenched the idea that the future of the region and the fate of its peoples would be decided by external powers with their own agendas and interests, with no regard to the desires and aspirations of the local inhabitants. This willful disregard for existing social structures would later create hotspots of tension and conflict within the newly formed states.
Just 1 year later, another transformation of no less importance and impact arrived: the Balfour Declaration of 1917. This fateful promise came in a different context, though it was closely linked to the course of the First World War and the rivalry of great powers. Britain, in the midst of its existential struggle, was desperately seeking to rally the broadest possible international support for its escalating war effort. Britain saw in the Zionist movement, which was highly active among influential Jewish communities, a force that could be harnessed to advance its strategic interests. The short and famous letter sent by British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour was not merely a declaration of humanitarian sympathy. It was a public endorsement by the British government of an ambitious political project to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. But this promise was deliberately ambiguous and carried inherent contradictions, stipulating that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, who constituted the overwhelming majority of the population. This declaration, issued by a great power that controlled Palestine at the time, gave the Zionist movement, until then a political movement with theoretical goals, a cloak of political legitimacy, and with it, immense support from one of the world's most powerful nations. The Balfour Declaration transformed the ambitions of the Zionist movement into a viable political project on the ground, opening the door wide for organized Jewish immigration and the establishment of institutions upon which the future state would be built. But this promise was the spark that ignited the long and ongoing conflict over land and identity in Palestine.
Together, these two events, Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration, constituted a radical redesign of the Middle East. They unleashed a series of deep and interconnected effects, touching every social, political, and economic component of the region, with echoes that reverberate to this day. The most immediate and profound impact was the dismantling of the relative political unity that had existed under Ottoman rule for centuries, replacing it with the modern nation-state system, modeled on European concepts. This was not a simple, arbitrary redrawing of lines on a map, but a complex process with deep social and political consequences. Artificial borders and fragmented societies. The new borders were drawn arbitrarily and hastily, often with no regard for natural geography, demographic distribution, or existing social and economic ties. This led to the separation of tribes, families, and communities that had once formed integrated wholes across what are now the Syrian-Iraqi or Syrian-Lebanese borders. For example, historic Kurdistan was divided among several nascent states, planting the seeds of Kurdish nationalist movements demanding rights and self-determination. Forced unification and challenges of nation-building. Conversely, diverse ethnic, religious, and sectarian groups with complex histories of rivalry and coexistence were brought together within a single political entity, as was the case in the creation of Iraq. This situation created enormous challenges in building a cohesive national identity, and laid the groundwork for internal conflict dynamics over power, resources, and representation among the various components.
The geopolitical restructuring of the region was not merely an administrative division. It led to the birth of new players on the regional and international stage, and radically altered the existing balance of power. The birth of modern Turkey and its regional influence. The Turkish nationalists' rejection of the Treaty of Sèvres led to the Turkish War of Independence and the birth of the modern Republic of Turkey. This not only established a powerful state in the northern part of the region, but also created a legacy of tension and unresolved issues concerning minorities within its borders. It also left behind historical aspirations to regain influence in former imperial territories, a legacy that continues to shape Turkey's regional policies today. The establishment of mandate entities. States like Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, along with the Gulf Emiratis and Sheikdoms, emerged as new political entities under the mandate system. This forced linkage of these entities to the mandate powers made their security and economies closely tied to Western interests. It turned the region into an arena for larger rivalries between great powers, shaping a geopolitical dynamic that still echoes today.
The Balfour Declaration was not just a political decision. It became a model and an embodiment of how major international decisions made without regard for the rights of local populations can shape the destinies of entire peoples. This declaration ignited a bitter and continuous conflict with vast regional and international repercussions. The declaration laid the foundation for a sharp and escalating conflict between the internationally backed Zionist movement and the local Palestinian population. This was not merely a border dispute, but evolved into an existential conflict over the right to land and self-determination. It culminated in the 1948 war, the Nakba, which led to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, an issue that remains at the core of the Arab-Israeli conflict to this day. The Palestinian cause became a point of sharp political polarization, not only among Arab and Muslim governments, but also among peoples across the globe. It has been used to justify domestic and foreign policies, to rally popular support, and to define political alignments, and even to classify friends and foes. This contributed to the rise of nationalist, pan-Arab, and Islamist ideologies that viewed the Palestinian cause as a symbol of resistance against foreign domination and historical injustice.
The motives behind these agreements were not only strategic and political. There were powerful economic drivers as well, particularly concerning the control of international trade routes and access to future natural resources, chief among them, the increasingly important oil. The newly drawn borders and infrastructure, such as oil pipelines, were designed primarily to serve the interests of the mandate powers. For example, the rich oil fields of Kirkuk in Mosul were connected to Mediterranean ports under British and French control, not to benefit the local economies, but to support the strategic needs of European empires. The emphasis on extracting and exporting primary resources, especially oil and gas, in many of the new states, established what would become a rentier economic model, a model heavily reliant on external revenues rather than on building a diversified, self-sustaining local economy. This economic system helped entrench the political and financial dependency of these states on the great powers, a dependency whose consequences are still deeply felt today.
Therefore, the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration were not simply bilateral deals to divide land or declare intentions about Palestine's future. They were a comprehensive and complex restructuring of society, politics, and the economy in the Middle East. These pivotal transformations affected the life of every individual and every community in the region by creating new borders that both forcibly separated and united, by shifting the balance of power, and by planting the seeds of chronic conflicts whose painful consequences the region continues to reap to this day. Understanding these historical roots is the key to comprehending our complex present and to searching for a better future. In the next episode of The Great Transformations from Maps to Upheavals, we will explore how this process of redrawing the map had another forgotten victim, when an entire people and their rights were ignored in a subsequent treaty that would radically reshape the region. We will talk about the Treaty of Lausanne of 1923 and its deep and lasting impact on the fate of the Kurdish people and the division of their lands among several nations. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss new episodes from this important analytical series. We want to hear your opinions and reflections on this episode and what questions you'd like us to explore in future ones. Share your thoughts with us in the comments section below the video. Thank you for watching. Until next time.